With the federal welfare reform law putting pressure on recipients to land jobs immediately, New York City needs to find ways to put able-bodied persons to work. The city's work experience program, known as WEP, claims to have placed thousands. But early indications show there are problems with WEP, most notably a failure to move its workers into real jobs. I'm David R. Jones, president of the Community Service Society, an organization that focuses on the problems of the poor of the city. Today, the Urban Agenda will examine what the city can do to both strengthen its economy and provide jobs for those seeking work. We have as our guest Congressman Jerrold Nadler, a Democrat who represents the west side of Manhattan.
And part of Brooklyn.
And part of Brooklyn. Absolutely. As a Brooklynite, I want everyone to know. I think anyone in this audience must have heard of your proposal to try to create a deep water port and rail link for New York, something that really has been off the drawing boards now for years, but you've been persisting at it for 5 years, and suddenly you're picking up strength. Can you tell us a little about the project, and then we'll talk about how it impacts on welfare?
Well, it's really several projects. I think you have to know a little background. First of all, the city, what I've been saying for many years is that we can't write off the blue-collar economy. We have to have a variegated economy, service sector, manufacturing sector, white-collar, blue-collar. We have to have jobs for people who aren't college graduates. And we can't depend on them being waiters in hotels all the time. And we have been losing manufacturing jobs in New York City at 6 times the national rate of manufacturing job loss. We've lost 30% of our jobs in manufacturing in the last 15 years. And we've been chasing them out. One of the reasons for this is that we are the only major city in North America where everything comes in and goes out by truck. Nationwide, 41% of all intercity freight goes by railroad. In New York City, Long Island, Westchester, Putnam, Rhode Island, Connecticut, 2.8% instead of 41%. This means that it pollutes our air. Our total dependence on trucking pollutes our air, tears up our streets, breaks our water mains, adds a dime to the cost of every grapefruit you buy in shipping costs, and destroys the ability of manufacturing to compete. It has eliminated unnecessarily hundreds of thousands, quite literally, of jobs. And if we reconnected with the United States by rail so that shippers could choose what was most convenient and cheapest and most efficient for them, whether to ship by truck or by rail, we could regain tens of thousands of jobs. So that's the first part. We have to reconnect by rail. The second part is that we have been losing our predominance as the major shipping port on the Eastern Seaboard. Last year, we did about 2.2 million, the entire port, New York and New Jersey combined, did about 2.2 million TEUs. That's trailer equivalent units, that's containers.
Right.
2.2 million containers, or TEUs, I'll call them, in the port. 93% of that on the New Jersey side, by the way.
Right. That
supported about 180,000 jobs in our region. If we don't become a hub port, the shipping companies are following the airlines. There's going to be one hub port and a series of feeder ports on the Eastern Seaboard. If we don't become the hub port, if we become a feeder port, we will lose between 40 and 50% of those 180,000 jobs in the region. If we become the hub port, well, a recent city study said that we could go from 2.2 million TEUs to as many as 10 million, maybe 14 or 15 million in the next 30 or 40 years.
Right.
So between losing 90,000 jobs on the one hand or gaining a few 100,000 on the other, that's the choice. Now, right now, we're going to lose the race to become the hub port to either Norfolk, Virginia, or to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And yet we should win it. We have tremendous geographic advantages. If we did our job right, no one could compete with us. We are the advantages we have is that we're in the middle of the East Coast megalopolis that goes from Virginia to New Hampshire. Norfolk is at the southern edge, and Halifax way north of it. We have the largest regional market, 25 million people. Norfolk's maybe 1 million, and Halifax is nothing. We are at the entrance to the only sea level route to the interior of the continent. You want to go west from any other port, you got to climb mountains. Whether you do that by mule 100 years ago or by any train or truck today, it takes energy and money. Those are our advantages. And yet we will lose because we cannot accommodate the deeper ships. To accommodate the deeper ships, we have to take the major part of the port out of Newark Bay, put it in New York Harbor, that means Brooklyn or the eastern side of Staten Island or even Bayonne, and we need a rail freight tunnel under the harbor to connect our rail and to enable us to have the port in Brooklyn. If we made this investment, we could have a renaissance of manufacturing jobs, of warehousing jobs, port-related jobs, and we could compete again on the basis of geographic advantage as we did for 100 years. Today, our economic development strategy, I don't care who the mayor is in this respect, essentially can be caricatured as saying to our chief industries, finance, insurance, stay here because they can move easily.
Right.
Stay here because we will give you an environment of lower taxes, lower wages, and lousier social services than elsewhere. That's not the basis to compete.
How much? How much would this investment cost, and what is there a realistic chance that our state and city is going to come up with this kind of cash, or obviously the federal investment as well?
Well, the tunnel, the rail freight tunnel, would probably, the estimates are that it would cost in the neighborhood of $900 million. A lot of that could be paid for in a private-public partnership. You could put tolls on it, so you float bonds and pay them back from tolls, the way we finance the thruway or the turnpike.
Right.
Get federal money for it. It's not a heck of a lot of money. They're talking about $1 billion for Yankee Stadium. A rail freight tunnel, which enables you to compete and have an economy, is worth a Yankee Stadium.
Right.
The port project, depending how much you want to do it and how big, you could probably do it for about $2 billion or $3 billion over a 40-year period. You're not talking about this over 5 years. Over a 40-year period, it's not a heck of a lot of money, especially since the extra tax revenue that the economic activity would generate a lot of the revenues for that.
How much would the feds have to kick in? What kind of federal approvals would you need? Can New York policymakers and elected officials do this on their own?
We can do this on our own from a policy perspective, from an institutional perspective. It would be nice for part of the cost to be borne by the federal government, obviously, and I think that can be done.
Right.
I mean, New York is part of gets transportation money, and a fairly large part of it every year, and part of that could be used for some of these expenditures. Question is, how do you want your transportation expenditures to be used? For mass transit, for rail freight, for more highways?
Right.
Those are policy choices.
So who have you lined up? Who's backing this now? Do you have across the?
Well, we have some support. To his great credit, Mayor Giuliani is the first mayor who's taken this seriously, and he's committed basically to the tunnel, to the rail freight tunnel,
right,
and the idea of the major port. And in fact, he has put city money into. They've done 2 studies. The city sponsored, the state co-sponsored one of them. One study on the port, which was very optimistic, or came out with very optimistic conclusions,
right,
I think realistic ones, and the other on the tunnel. Based on the tunnel study, which was a preliminary study, the city is now going to spend about $5 million for a more detailed engineering and environmental analysis of the tunnel. And in fact, just this past week, put out the RFP, the request for proposals, for some of the initial design studies of it. So the mayor's supporting it. The state AFL-CIO endorsed it a few years ago. The whole concept. The Long Island Association has now endorsed it. The Chamber of Commerce and Industry has endorsed it, and we're trying to get the attention of the governor. And the state administration.
Well, we haven't heard much, obviously. There is a connection between this and welfare reform, obviously. We have almost 420,000 people who, over the next 5 years, are going to have to find work. What impact would a major capital project of this potentially have on that?
Well, there are really 2 impacts.
Right.
Number one, the capital project obviously generates construction jobs.
Right.
I don't know how many construction jobs, but to build a rail freight tunnel is a lot of jobs. It's a major project. It's a $1 billion project, 900 million, whatever it is.
Could part of that be set aside for people coming off welfare?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like any other construction project, part of that could be set aside for people coming off welfare. But beyond the actual construction work is the fact that the whole purpose of this is to generate a lot more economic activity. We can't put all our eggs in increasingly fewer economic baskets, which is what we've been doing in New York for the last 40 years. We used to have a huge financial services industry, a huge insurance industry, a huge real estate industry, and a huge manufacturing sector. Now we have the first 3, but not the manufacturing sector. 1 million people worked in manufacturing in New York City 30 years ago. Today it's down to about 250,000. We have to have a broad variety of jobs so that if there's a recession on Wall Street, the city doesn't get killed.
Well, let's talk about recession. I mean, I know that the business cycle, at least some have argued, has been revoked. We're never going to have a downturn. But already with a boom going on, we have nearly 10% unemployment in New York City. What happens when a recession hits in this current environment?
New York's unemployment rate now in this boom is over twice the national rate. So we have some severe problems.
Right.
And we don't have enough jobs for people who don't have college diplomas, who are high school graduates or even less. We need jobs that they can have. We need jobs with upward mobility, which manufacturing has traditionally been. And it's interesting because we have increasingly narrowed our economy. The experience of our last two recessions shows what has happened. In the 1982 recession, New York was the last city in the country to go into the recession, the first city to come out of it, and had the lowest percentage job loss. In the 1991-92 recession, 10 years later, we were the first city to go into it. We're just coming out of it now, which is what, 6 years later,
right.
And we had by far the largest percentage job loss of any city in the country, and I don't even think we've yet recovered the total number of jobs that we had in 1990. So we went from the most resilient city, least affected by the business cycle, to the most depressed by the business cycle.
And of course there's a multiplier effect because we have a whole new cohort of unskilled and people coming in. 400,000 is huge. In a recent study we did, while the low-wage economy is vibrant, about 325,000 plus being generated every 1 year, we haven't factored in this new cohort of people.
Well, if you figure that you've got 10% unemployment, that's
right.
a few 100,000 people looking for work.
Right.
You add another 400,000, that's got to depress wage levels, it's got to make it harder. And whether, in fact, the people who go to work as a result, building a tunnel or as a result of the economic activity generated by the fact that you have the rail freight and the port activity, whether they are the people coming off welfare or not, is fundamentally not important. Because if they are not the people coming off welfare, the people who take those jobs will free up other jobs for the people coming off welfare. The point is, you're increasing the supply of labor. You've got to increase the supply of jobs.
Well, what's happening with the rest of the members of your delegation? Are they lining up? I mean, I'm convinced, and you know.
Well, I think there's broad, basic support among the members of Congress, but there's very little for Congress to do on this right now.
Yes.
What we have to do very specifically is local action by the state and city administrations, and on one level that's being done, the studies for the tunnel and the port are going forward. On another level, we're doing what we do often. We preclude major options without studying them. While we're studying this possibility on the one hand, we're taking actions that will eliminate the possibility. So the Harlem River Yard in the South Bronx, which is the one possible place in New York City for a major rail terminal, and you have a tunnel but no terminal, doesn't do you very much good. The Natural Resource Defense Council and the state are interested in putting a paper recycling plant there and eliminating about 2/3 of it. Now, you can put a paper recycling plant in dozens of places in the city. There's one place in New York City and one place only where you could put a major intermodal rail yard. So we have to stop that. Mm-hmm. We have to stop that and redirect it and devote. We've spent $300 million of state dollars since 1980 toward building certain structures to enable intermodal rail freight to get into Harlem River Yard, and now we're going to eliminate the yard because we forgot why we spent the $300 million, which will be totally wasted. The Conrail merger that's going through now, the merger right. where CSX and Norfolk Southern, two railroads, are buying Conrail, has got to be done. The city and state governments should be pressuring the federal government, which has to approve the merger, to condition that approval on the merger being changed in such a way that both Norfolk Southern and CSX come into New York, east of the river, so we're not at the mercy of a monopoly of one railroad, which is one of the problems we've had. We were at the mercy of the Conrail monopoly for the last 20 years. They're not focusing on this. 6 months from now will be too late.
What's wrong in New York State and City in terms of its inability to have sort of long-term planning on this sector? I mean, this isn't only with this issue. I mean, we've been looking, for instance, that you know, all the tax incentives that are given out doesn't really look at whether it actually produces jobs. I think Comptroller Advocacy came out with a report that a lot of the job creation going on in New York really isn't serving people within the 5 boroughs. Why this inability to plan?
Senator Leiter's been putting out those studies for a decade.
Yes. Why this inability to plan?
That's a good question. I mean, the planning mechanisms that we have don't work. The City Planning Commission, certainly in the transportation area, has been worse than useless for 20 years. The the NIMTIC, the New York Metropolitan Transportation Coordinating Council, was suspended by the federal government for not performing its basic planning functions as mandated by the federal transportation law. I don't know. I do know that the State Department of Transportation is essentially a highway department and has no interest in rail freight or port development, certainly none downstate. Buffalo area they pay a little attention, but nothing here. The Port Authority has been, under the current director, that may be changing, but for many years they were more interested in real estate projects like the Queens West project and other things than their basic job of mass transit and airports and rail freight.
Is there a bias against blue-collar workers? I mean, is this just the notion that the only thing that a city should really have are people on Wall Street? Is that part of the problem we're confronting?
Well, less so now, but there was for a long time. I mean, even the departments of city planning in schools in the 1980s were teaching that the manufacturing job loss was inevitable. Inevitable in the United States, inevitable in New York. They're getting away from this now. They're starting to reconsider that. But for a long time, you read even the New York Ascendant put out by the City Planning Commission in 1987, when Bobby Wagner was chairman, talked about how in the year 2000 we were going to be a magnificent city, but had nothing about manufacturing. It didn't see that. We were going to have all these service sector jobs and finance, insurance, and real estate, and so forth. But the fact is, they haven't produced the jobs.
It's interesting, you know, one of the groups you haven't reached yet, really, us do-gooder advocates for the poor and other representatives who are dealing with people in poverty, with high concentrations of welfare poor, have not really taken an advanced position on these issues. And I think there's been a long traditional problem that we've had. We at Community Service Society are suddenly shifting most of our attention to job creation as the only way to handle this, not because we like this way, not because we're putting aside the issue of actual service delivery, but clearly job development for low-wage workers is going to be critical for survival for tens of thousands of people. And clearly the way the city gives incentives, for instance, on capital projects, what the capital projects are, the question of do we start projects such as you're describing, which could have an enormous impact on absorbing low-wage workers.
And the question of do we do projects that destroy manufacturing? Right. For instance, there was 10 years ago, 13, 14 years ago, a bill in Albany that passed with the support of everybody. I was a very lone voice against it, to enable the Port Authority to start what's now the Queens West development. The problem with the Queens West development, 6,000 luxury or 7,000 luxury apartments along the East River in Queens, is that it's adjacent to the Long Island City industrial area. You put 7,000 luxury apartments and 3.5 million square feet of an upscale commercial mall next to an industrial area where there's 60,000 jobs, manufacturing jobs, and the land values will inevitably rise, and it becomes very profitable for the landowners to evict all the manufacturing jobs and convert it into commercial uses, basically, which they can do under the zoning laws. And 12, 13 years ago, I said, either you don't pass this bill, you don't do that project, or you take that manufacturing district and you give it special zoning protection to protect it, and that wasn't done.
Well, one of the arguments by the environmental movement, and we've certainly joined in it, is the issue of putting environmentally inappropriate projects near residential areas. We resisted the incinerator up in the South Bronx. We were in the vanguard of that and helping groups there. Clearly, what about the environmental problems here? There are environmental problems with putting manufacturing in a city so densely packed.
Well, depending what kind of manufacturing and where. There are very large areas which have traditionally been manufacturing and which the city is now looking at as empty and what do we want to do with them, superstores or condos or whatever. The fact is you need superstores somewhere, you need condos somewhere, but you also need your manufacturing jobs. And it's not a question of bringing manufacturing jobs into residential areas. It's a question of protecting some manufacturing areas from incursion by residential conversion or by commercial conversion. And the attitude has been for a long time that what I just said is an antediluvian, old-fashioned response, because we're going to lose the manufacturing jobs inevitably, so don't stand in the way of progress. Right. And that's an unfortunate attitude because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, from the environmental point of view, by the way, interestingly enough, everything I'm saying about port development and rail freight is very environmentally good. The environmentalists basically are supportive of it because every truck you take off the streets and put on a rail car Rail is less air pollution, and in addition to which, rail transportation is 3 times as energy efficient per ton mile as truck transportation.
Right.
So you use less oil, you're less dependent on the Arabs, and from any different aspect you want to look at, it's a good thing to do.
Well, how long? Say the planets all align, and this project suddenly gets an enormous boost, bipartisan, from approval to having it done. How many years are we talking?
Well, it depends what you mean by having it done. I mean, we're talking about a 40-year process. You don't go from 2.2 million TEUs to 10 or 15 overnight.
Right.
But if everything went as rapidly as it could be, the tunnel could be open in 7, 8 years.
Right.
More likely a few more years than that. You don't wait for the tunnel, however. You do an upgraded barge operation so you can get your port functioning for the deeper ships more quickly, because if we wait 10 years, the hub port's going to be in Halifax or Norfolk.
Right.
So, but you could start major larger port operations in a couple of years, easily.
What kind
you could start it tomorrow.
What kind of jobs would be available for low-wage workers in this immediately on the project, not the ancillary jobs? Would there be
construction jobs? Stevedoring jobs, warehousing jobs, all kinds of goods handling jobs.
Right.
I mean, you name it.
And the ancillary jobs that might come down?
Who knows?
We can't even tell yet.
Who knows? You're increasing greatly the level of economic activity, and that goes out. You have to understand, the history of New York is fundamentally a transportation history. In 1820, New York City had 2% of the nation's population, 2% of its commerce. Boston was 3%, Philadelphia about 2%. The Erie Canal, which connected the New York harbor with the interior of the country, opened in 1825. 5 years later, by 1830, we had 38% of the nation's shipping and commerce, up from 2% in 5 years. By 1900, we had 400% as much shipping as Philadelphia and Baltimore combined. And 2 projects built New York: the Erie Canal and the Erie Railroad. And interestingly enough, the Erie Railroad, which was a private project, went bankrupt 4 times. Everybody touched it, went bankrupt, but it built a state.
Still built.
It built a state. It should have been a government. Today we'd say it should have been a government subsidized project. In this century, we've not done anything similar. We've not kept pace. We're the only major port city in the United States that never built a rail freight tunnel or bridge under or over the harbor or river. We got disconnected by rail from the rest of the country. We've lost our port business. But in the 1800s, the whole city grew up because of the Erie Canal, because you had that connection. You had all the shipping and the commerce, the manufacturing developed around it. In concentric circles around that, Wall Street started developing the financial services to service the financial and the shipping and the maritime interests. The legal and the accounting developed to service that, and everything built out from that. Right. And then in this century, we rested on our laurels for 40 years, and we've been collapsing slowly for the last 40 because we took out the middle of the concentric circles.
Now, we've talked a little about the rail tunnel, we've talked about the harbor. Do you have any other ideas that are starting to emerge in terms of what kind of capital development might actually help low-wage workers in New York?
Well, any capital development helps low-wage workers because it generates construction jobs. Right. But clearly, we have to be building, I mean, if you want to talk in real terms, not just transportation, why are we not building multiples of the amount of low and moderate income housing that we're building? The federal government's got out of the housing business. Right. The state's doing very little. We used to depend on 30, 40,000 units a year. Now we're doing 5, and all luxury. We need housing. We need housing rehabilitation. We need housing building in this city, not just luxury. Now, that generates jobs.
Could this be a public works project? I mean, there is going to be a discussion. No one wants to talk about it yet. Almost certainly, welfare reform is not going to allow all people who are currently on welfare to end up in full-time private sector jobs. And there has been some growing discussion about when everyone gets used to it, what kind of public works would be the appropriate engagement for people on public assistance?
Well, public works are a good thing in and of themselves because they generate jobs, they generate economic activity.
Right.
And it's been said that you can't spend yourself to prosperity. That's not correct. Right. It's exactly how we did it, how we got out of the Great Depression. People say it wasn't the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression, it was World War II. But from an economic perspective, what was World War II? A huge government-sponsored public works program.
That's for sure.
Now, the money was spent on bombs and bullets instead of on useful things.
Right.
But from an economic point of view, it ended the Depression. It got this country on its feet again. It was a government-sponsored, huge public works program paid for by huge taxes and huge borrowing, and it was a one. Never mind, it wasn't a wonderful thing, but from an economic point of view, it was a wonderful thing. So from this point of view, I am one of the people, one of the very few people in Congress who says I'm in favor of deficit spending when it's done right. Right. And a very large public works program on intelligent public works, on things that pay economic dividends, that put people to work, that makes sense. The right transportation projects, not ones that simply concentrate more trucks at tunnel entrances. Transportation projects, housing, schools, all of these things pay off. Fiber optic networks, right. We are spending in this country at the rate of 1/12 of what our economic competitors are spending on public infrastructure. That's going to make our economy inefficient 20 years down the road. It's going to hurt our competitive position. We're spending a fraction of what we ought to be spending on research and development. That's another public work. If we want to have things to sell 20 years from now, we'd better hike both private and public sector research and development spending.
I think it would be important, particularly for projects like you. We at the Community Service Society have been trying to put together what we call a Jobs Authority, which basically is a booster to the notion of capital development projects and bring in not-for-profits and people interested in poverty as well as the general good to try to start to create a cohesive and coherent policy on creating new low-wage jobs.
Well, we have in Congress the Martinez bill, which I'm a co-sponsor of, which is a major public works bill. Unfortunately, it's out of fashion politically these days. This is the kind of thing that liberal Democrats, most Democrats would have supported 30 years ago. It is still necessary.
Well, I would say, Congressman, that just on behalf of this one person trying to represent poor people, that this is the kind of project probably that's going to be necessary if it's going to have any hope in changing outcomes.
But let me just say one thing. The public works projects, such as I just said, the Martinez bill, that's not in the cards politically right now. Maybe the political climate will change. Right. But the kind of thing we were talking about before, making New York a major port again, doing the rail freight that we have to do, this is not liberal, it's not conservative, it's common sense if you actually look at geography. Right. We don't teach geography anymore. And apparently our politicians don't know enough geography, or a lot of them. But this is a not ideological project. We have in New York today something called the New York Task Force on the Port, Rail Freight, and Industrial Development. It's co-chaired by myself and the chairman of the New York State Conservative Party, Mike Long, because he understands this basic economics. It's not a political, it's not a political ideological issue. It's a political issue in the sense of saying we've got to do it.
Survival. Thank you very much, Congressman Nadler. For those with limited education and job training, New York City's manufacturing industries have traditionally provided the first step on the rung of employment. But in the last few decades, manufacturers have been abandoning the city for southern and foreign locations. The demand for low-skilled jobs is now greater than ever, and we must find new ways to employ those who want to work. A project like Congressman Nadler's Deepwater Port and Rail Link could generate thousands, if not tens of thousands, of jobs. We need to explore and support other useful ideas on job creation to revitalize New York City's economy and provide an atmosphere where all its residents have the opportunity to work. This is your host, David R. Jones. Thank you for joining us on the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.